Chapter 7. Too extreme for the Guinness Book of World Records. Sleep deprivation and the brain. Struck by the weight of damning scientific evidence, the Guinness Book of World Records has stopped recognizing attempts to break the sleep deprivation world record. Recall that Guinness deems it acceptable for a man, Felix Baumgartner, to ascend 128,000 feet into the outer reaches of our atmosphere in a hot air balloon wearing a spacesuit, open the door of his capsule, stand atop a ladder suspended above the planet, and then free fall back down to Earth at a top speed of 843 miles per hour. 1,358 kilometers per hour, passing through the sound barrier while creating a sonic boom with just his body. But the risks associated with sleep deprivation are considered to be far, far higher, unacceptably high, in fact, based on the evidence. What is that compelling evidence? In the following 2 chapters, we will learn precisely why and how sleep loss inflicts such devastating effects on the brain, linking it to numerous neurological and psychiatric conditions, for example, Alzheimer's disease, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, suicide, stroke, and chronic pain, and on every physiological system of the body, further contributing to countless disorders and disease, for example cancer, diabetes, heart attacks, infertility, weight gain, obesity, and immune deficiency. No facet of the human body is spared the crippling, noxious harm of sleep loss. We are, as you will see, socially, organizationally, economically, physically, behaviorally, nutritionally, linguistically, cognitively, and emotionally dependent upon sleep. This chapter deals with the dire and sometimes deadly consequences of inadequate sleep on the brain. The chapter that follows will recount the diverse, though equally ruinous, and similarly fatal effects of short sleep on the body. Pay attention. There are many ways in which a lack of sufficient sleep will kill you. Some take time. Others are far more immediate. One brain function that buckles under even the smallest dose of sleep deprivation is concentration. The deadly societal consequences of these concentration failures play out most obviously and fatally in the form of drowsy driving. Every hour, someone dies in a traffic accident in the U.S. due to a fatigue-related error. There are 2 main culprits of drowsy driving accidents. The first is people completely falling asleep at the wheel. This happens infrequently, however, and usually requires an individual to be acutely sleep deprived. Having gone without shut-eye for 20-plus hours, the second more common cause is a momentary lapse in concentration called a microsleep. These last for just a few seconds, during which time the eyelid will either partially or fully close. They are usually suffered by individuals who are chronically sleep restricted, defined as getting less than 7 hours of sleep at night on a routine basis. During a microsleep, your brain becomes blind to the outside world for a brief moment, and not just the visual domain, but in all channels of perception. Most of the time, you have no awareness of the event. More problematic is that your decisive control of motor actions, such as those necessary for operating a steering wheel or a brake pedal, will momentarily cease. As a result, you don't need to fall asleep for 10 to 15 seconds to die while driving. 2 seconds will do it. A 2-second micro-sleep at 30 miles per hour with a modest angle of drift can result in your vehicle transitioning entirely from one lane to the next. This includes into oncoming traffic. Should this happen at 60 miles per hour, it may be the last microsleep you ever have. David Dinges at the University of Pennsylvania, a titan in the field of sleep research and personal hero of mine, has done more than any scientist in history to answer the following fundamental question. What is the cycle rate of a human being? That is, how long can a human go without sleep before the performance is objectively impaired? How much sleep can a human lose each night, and over how many nights before critical processes of the brain fail? Is that individual even aware of how impaired they are when sleep deprived? How many nights of recovery sleep does it take to restore the stable performance of a human after sleep loss? Dinge's research employs a disarmingly simple attention test to measure concentration. You must press a button in response to a light that appears on a bottom box or computer screen within a set period of time. Your response and the reaction time of that response are both measured. Thereafter, another light comes on, and you do the same thing. The lights appear in an unpredictable manner, sometimes in quick succession, other times randomly separated by a pause lasting several seconds. Sounds easy, right? Try doing it for 10 minutes straight every day for 14 days. That's what Dinges and his research team did to a large number of subjects who were monitored under strict laboratory conditions. All of the subjects start off by getting a full 8-hour sleep opportunity the night before the test, allowing them to be assessed when fully rested. Then the participants were divided into 4 different experimental groups, rather like a drug study. Each group was given a different dose of sleep deprivation. One group was kept up for 72 hours straight, going without sleep for 3 consecutive nights. The second group was allowed 4 hours of sleep each night. The third group was given 6 hours of sleep each night. The lucky fourth group was allowed to keep sleeping 8 hours each night. There were 3 key findings. First, although sleep deprivation of all these varied amounts caused a slowing in reaction time, there was something more telling. Participants would, for brief moments, stop responding altogether. Slowness was not the most sensitive signature of sleepiness. Entirely missed responses were. Dinges was capturing lapses, otherwise known as microsleeps, the real-life equivalent of which would be falling to react to a child who runs out in front of your car when chasing a ball. When describing the findings, Dinges will often have you think of the repeating beep from a heart monitor in a hospital. Beep, beep, beep. Now picture the dramatic sound effect you hear in emergency room television dramas when a patient starts to slip away as doctors frantically try to save their life. At first the heartbeats are constant, beep, 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 as are your responses on the visual attention task when you are well rested, stable, regular. Switch to your performance when sleep deprived, and it is the oral equivalent of the patients in the hospital going into cardiac arrest. Beep, 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 beep. Your performance has flatlined. No conscious response, no motor response, a microsleep. And then the heartbeat comes back as will your performance. Beep, 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 beep. But only for a short while. Soon you have another arrest. Beep, beep, beep. More microsleeps. Comparing the number of lapses or microsleeps day after day across the 4 different experimental groups gave Dinges a second key finding. Those individuals who slept 8 hours every night maintained a stable, near-perfect performance across the 2 weeks. Those in the 3-night total sleep deprivation group suffered a catastrophic impairment, which was no real surprise. After the first night of no sleep at all, their lapses in concentration missed responses increased by over 400%. The surprise was that these impairments continued to escalate at the same ballistic rate after a second and third night of total sleep deprivation, as if they would continue to escalate in severity if more nights of sleep were lost, showing no signs of flattening out. But it was the two partial sleep deprivation groups that brought the most concerning message of all. After 4 hours of sleep for 6 nights, participants' performance was just as bad as those who had not slept for 24 hours straight. That is, a 400% increase in the number of microsleeps. By day 11, on this diet of 4 hours of sleep at night, participants' performance had degraded even further, matching that of someone who had pulled two back-to-back all-nighters going without sleep for 48 hours. Most worrying from a societal perspective were the individuals in the group who obtained 6 hours of sleep a night, something that may sound familiar to many of you. 10 days of 6 hours of sleep a night was all it took to become as impaired in performance as going without sleep for 24 hours straight. And like the total sleep deprivation group, the accruing performance impairment in the 4 hour and 6 hour sleep groups showed no signs of leveling out. All signs suggest that if the experiment had continued, the performance deterioration would continue to build up over weeks or months. Another research study, this one led by Dr. Gregory Belenky at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, published almost identical results around the same time. They also tested 4 groups of participants, but they were given 9 hours, 7 hours, 5 hours, and 3 hours of sleep across 7 days. You do not know how sleep deprived you are when you are sleep deprived. The third key finding, common to both of these studies, is the one I personally think is the most harmful of all. When participants were asked about their subjective sense of how impaired they were, they constantly underestimated their degree of performance disability. It was a miserable predictor of how bad their performance actually, objectively was. It is the equivalent of someone at a bar who has had far too many drinks, picking up his car keys and confidently telling you, "I'm fine to drive home." Similarly problematic is baseline residing. With chronic sleep restriction over months or years, an individual will actually acclimate to their impaired performance, lower alertness, and reduced energy levels. That low-level exhaustion becomes their accepted norm or baseline. Individuals fail to recognize how their perennial state of sleep deficiency has come to compromise their mental attitude and physical vitality, including the slow accumulation of ill health. A link between the former and latter is rarely made in their mind. Based on epidemiological studies of average sleep time, millions of individuals unwittingly spend years of their life in a suboptimal state of psychological and physiological functioning, never maximizing the potential of mind or body due to their blind persistence in sleeping too little. 60 years of scientific research prevent me from accepting anyone who tells me that he or she can get by on just 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night just fine. Returning to Din's study results, you may have predicted that optimal performance would return to all of the participants after a good long night of recovery sleep, similar to many people's notion of sleeping it off on the weekends to pay off their weeknight sleep debts. However, even after 3 nights of ad-lib recovery, sleep performance did not return to that observed at the original baseline assessment when those same individuals had been getting a full 8 hours of sleep regularly. Nor did any group recover all the sleep hours they had lost in the days prior. As we have already learned, the brain is incapable of that. In a disturbing later study, researchers in Australia took 2 groups of healthy adults, one of whom they got drunk to the legal driving limit, 0.08% blood alcohol, the other of whom they sleep deprived for a single night. Both groups performed a concentration test to assess attention performance, especially the number of lapses. After being awake for 19 hours, people who were sleep deprived were as cognitively impaired as those who were legally drunk. Said another way, if you wake up at 7 a.m. and remain awake throughout the day, then go out socializing with friends until late that evening, yet drink no alcohol whatsoever, by the time you are driving home at 2 a.m., you are as cognitively impaired in your ability to attend to the road and what is around you as a legally drunk driver. In fact, participants in the above study started their nosedive in performance after just 15 hours of being awake. 10 p.m. in the above scenario. Car crashes rank among the leading causes of death in most first world nations. In 2016, the AAA Foundation in Washington, D.C. released the results of an extensive study of over 7,000 drivers in the U.S. tracked in details over a 2-year period. The key finding shown in Figure 12 reveals just how catastrophic drowsy driving is when it comes to car crashes. Operating on less than 5 hours of sleep, your risk of a car crash increases threefold. Get behind the wheel of a car when having slept just 4 hours or less the night before, and you are 11.5 times more likely to be involved in a car accident. Note how the relationship between decrease in hours of sleep and decrease in mortality, the risk of an accident, is not linear, but instead exponentially mushrooms. Each hour of sleep loss vastly amplifies that crash likelihood rather than incrementally nudging it up. Figure 12. Sleep loss and car crashes increase crash risk. Drunk driving and drowsy driving are deadly propositions in their own right, but what happens when someone combines them? It is a relevant question since most individuals are driving drunk in the early morning hours rather than in the middle of the day, meaning that most drunk drivers are also sleep deprived. We can now monitor driver error in a realistic but safe way using driving simulators. With such a virtual machine, a group of researchers examined the number of complete off-road deviations in participants placed under 4 different experimental conditions. 1. 8 hours of sleep. 2. 4 hours of sleep. 3. 8 hours of sleep plus alcohol to the point of being legally drunk. And 4 hours of sleep plus alcohol to the point of being legally drunk. Those in the 8-hour sleep group had few, if any, off-road errors. Those in the 4-group sleep condition, the second group, had 6 times more off-road deviation than the sober, well-rested individuals. The same degree of driving impairments was true of the third group, who had 8 hours of sleep but were legally drunk. driving drunk or driving drowsy were both dangerous and equally dangerous. A reasonable expectation was that performance in the fourth group of participants would reflect the addictive impact of these two groups: 4 hours of sleep plus the effect of alcohol, 12 times more off-road deviation. It was far worse. This group of participants drove off the road almost 30 times more than the well-rested sober group. The heady cocktail of sleep loss and alcohol was not additive, but instead multiplicative. They magnified each other, like two drugs whose effects are harmful by themselves, but when taken together, interact to produce truly dire consequences. After 30 years of intensive research, we can now answer many of the questions posted earlier. The recycle rate of a human being is around 16 hours. After 16 hours of being awake, the brain begins to fail. Humans need more than 7 hours of sleep each night to maintain cognitive performance. After 10 days of just 7 hours of sleep, the brain is as dysfunctional as it would be after going without sleep for 24 hours. 3 full nights of recovery sleep, more nights than a weekend, are insufficient to restore performance back to normal levels after a week of short sleep. And finally, the human mind cannot accurately sense how sleep deprived it is when sleep deprived. We shall return to the ramifications of these results in the remaining chapters, but the real-life consequences of drowsy driving deserve special mention. This coming week, more than 2 million people in the U.S. will fall asleep while driving their motor vehicle. That's more than 250,000 every day, with more such events during the week than weekends for obvious reasons. More than 56 million Americans admit to struggling to stay awake at the wheel of a car each month. As a result, 1.2 million accidents are caused by sleepiness each year in the United States. Said another way, for every 30 seconds you've been reading this book, there has been a car accident somewhere in the U.S. caused by sleepiness. It is more than probable that someone has lost their life in a fatigue-related car accident during the time you have been reading this chapter. You may find it surprising to learn that vehicle accidents caused by drowsy driving exceed those caused by alcohol and drugs combined. Drowsy driving alone is worse than driving drunk. That may seem like a controversial or irresponsible thing to say, and I do not wish to trivialize the lamentable act of drunk driving by any means. Yet, my statement is true for the following simple reason. Drunk drivers are often late in braking and late in making evasive maneuvers. But when you fall asleep or have a microsleep, you stop reacting altogether. A person who experiences a microsleep or who has fallen asleep at the wheel does not brake at all, nor do they make any attempt to avoid the accident. As a result, car crashes caused by drowsiness tend to be far more deadly than those caused by alcohol or drugs. Said crassly, when you fall asleep at the wheel of your car on a freeway, there is now a 1-ton missile traveling at 65 miles per hour, and no one is in control. Drivers of cars are not the only threats. More dangerous are drowsy truckers. Approximately 80% of truck drivers in the U.S. are overweight, and 50% are clinically obese. This place truck drivers at a far higher risk of a disorder called sleep apnea, commonly associated with heavy snoring, which causes chronic, severe sleep deprivation. As a result, these truck drivers are 200 to 500% more likely to be involved in a traffic accident. And when a truck driver loses his or her life in a drowsy driving crash, they will, on average, take 4.5 other lives with them. In actual fact, I would like to argue that there are no accidents caused by fatigue, microsleeps, or falling asleep. None whatsoever. They are crashes. The Oxford English Dictionary defines accidents as unexpected events that happened by chance or without apparent cause. Drowsy driving deaths are neither chance nor without cause. They are predictable and the direct result of not obtaining sufficient sleep. As such, they are unnecessary and preventable. Shamefully, governments of most developed countries spend less than 1% of their budget educating the public on the dangers of drowsy driving relative to what they invest in combating drunk driving. Even well-meaning public health messages can get lost in a barrage of statistics. It often takes this tragic recounting of personal stories to make the message real. There are thousands of such events that I could describe. Let me offer just one in the hopes of saving you from the harms of driving drowsy. Let me offer just one in the hopes of saving you from the harms of driving drowsy. Union County, Florida, January 2006. A school bus transporting 9 children came to a halt at a stop sign. A Pontiac Bonneville car carrying 7 occupants pulled up behind the bus and also came to a stop. At this moment, an 18-wheel truck came barreling down the road behind both vehicles. It didn't stop. The truck struck the Pontiac, riding up over it, and the car concertinaed underneath, then hit the bus. All 3 vehicles traveled through a ditch and continued moving, at which point the unplodded Pontiac became engulfed in flames. The school bus rotated counterclockwise and kept traveling, now on the opposite side of the road, back to front. It did so for 328 feet until it went off the road and collided with a thick grove of trees. 3 of the 9 children in the bus were ejected through the windows upon impact. All 7 passengers in the Pontiac were killed, as was the bus driver. The truck driver and all 9 children in the bus sustained serious injuries. The trucker was a qualified and legally licensed driver. All toxicology tests performed on his blood were negative. However, it later emerged that he had been awake for 34 hours straight and had fallen asleep at the wheel. All of the Pontiac's 7 occupants who died were children or adolescents. 5 of the 7 were children in the Pontiac car were from a single family. The oldest occupant was a teenager who had been legally driving the car. The youngest occupant was a baby of just 20 months old. There are many things that I hope readers take away from this book. This is one of the most important. If you are drowsy while driving, please stop. It is lethal. To carry the burden of another's death on your shoulders is a terrible thing. Don't be misled by the many ineffective tactics people will tell you can battle back against drowsiness while driving. Many of us think we can overcome drowsiness through sheer force or of will, but sadly this is not true. To assume otherwise can jeopardize your life, the lives of your life or friends in the car with you, and the lives of other road users. Some people only get one chance to fall asleep at the wheel before losing their life. If you notice yourself feeling drowsy while driving or actually falling asleep at the wheel, stop for the night. If you really must keep going and you have made that judgment in the life-threatening context, it genuinely pauses, then pull off the road into a safe lay-by for a short time. Take a brief nap, 20 or to 30 minutes. When you wake up, do not start driving. You will be suffering from sleep inertia, the carryover effects of sleep into wakefulness. Wait for another 20 to 30 minutes, perhaps after having a cup of coffee if you really must, and only then start driving again. This, however, will only get you so far down the road before you need another such recharge, and the returns are diminishing. Ultimately, it is just not worth the life cost. Can apps help? In the 1980s and 90s, David Dinges, together with his astute collaborator and recent administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Dr. Mark Rosekind, conducted another series of groundbreaking studies, this time examining the upsides and downsides of napping in the face of unavoidable sleep deprivation. They coined the term power naps, or should I say, suited to it. Much of their work was with the aviation industry, examining pilots on long-haul travel. The most dangerous time of flight is landing, which arrives at the end of a journey, when the greatest amount of sleep deprivation has often occurred. Recall how tired and sleepy you are at the end of an overnight transatlantic flight, having been on the go for more than 24 hours. Would you feel at peak performance, ready to land a Boeing 747 with 467 passengers on board? Should you have the skill to do so? It is during this end phase of flight, known in the aviation industry as top of descent to London, that 68% of all hull losses, a euphemism for a catastrophic plane crash, occur. The researchers set to work answering the following question, posed by the U.S. Federal Aviation Authority, FAA. If a pilot can only obtain a short nap opportunity 40 to 120 minutes within a 36-hour period, when should it occur so as to minimize cognitive fatigue and attention lapses? At the start of the first evening, in the middle of the night, or late the following morning? It first appeared to be counterintuitive but Dinges and Rosekind made a clever biology-based prediction. They believed that by inserting a nap at the front end of an oncoming bout of sleep deprivation, you could insert a buffer, albeit temporary and partial, that would protect the brain from suffering catastrophic lapses in concentration. They were right. Pilots suffered fewer microsleeps at the end stages of the flight if the naps were taken early that prior evening, versus if those same nap periods were taken in the middle of the night or later that next morning, when the attack of sleep deprivation was already well underway. They had discovered the sleep equivalent of the medical paradigm of prevention versus treatment. The former tries to avert an issue prior to occurrence. The latter tries to remedy the issue after it has happened, and so it was with naps. Indeed, these short sleep bouts taken early also reduced the number of times the pilots drifted into light sleep during the critical final 90 minutes of flight. There were fewer of these sleep intrusions measured by EEG electrodes on the head. When Dinges and Rosekind reported their findings to the FAA, they recommended that prophylactic naps taken early during long-haul flights, should be instituted as policy among pilots, as many other aviation authorities around the world now permit. The FAA, while believing the findings, was not convinced by the nomenclature. They believed the term prophylactic was ripe for many a snide joke among pilots. They just suggested the alternative of planned napping. The FAA didn't like this either, feeling it to be too management-like. Their suggestion was power napping, which they believed was more fitting with leadership or dominance-based job positions, others being CEOs or military executives, and so the power nap was born. The problem, however, is that people, especially those in such positions, came to erroneously believe that a 20-minute power nap was all you needed to survive and function with perfect or even acceptable acumen. Brief power naps have become synonymous with the inaccurate assumption that they allow an individual to forego sufficient sleep night after night, especially when combined with the liberal use of caffeine. No matter what you may have heard or read in the popular media, there is no scientific evidence we have suggesting that a drug, a device, or any amount of physiological or any amount of psychological willpower can replace sleep. Power naps may momentarily increase basic concentration under conditions of sleep deprivation, as can caffeine up to a certain dose. But in the subsequent studies that Dinges and many other researchers, myself included, have performed, neither naps nor caffeine can salvage more complex functions of the brain, including learning, memory, emotional stability, complex reasoning, or decision-making. One day we may discover such a counteractive method. Currently, however, there is no drug that has the proven ability to replace those benefits that a full night of sleep infuses into the brain and body. David Dinges has extended an open invitation to anyone suggesting that they can survive on short sleep to come to his lab for a 10-day stay. He will place that individual on their proclaimed regimens of short sleep and measure their cognitive function. Dinges is rightly confident he'll show, categorically, a degradation of brain and body function. To date, no volunteers have matched up to their claim. We have, however, discovered a very rare collection of individuals who appear to be able to survive on 6 hours of sleep, and how minimal impairments a sleepless elite, as it were. Give them hours and hours of sleep opportunity in the laboratory with no alarms or wake-up calls, and still they naturally sleep this short amount and no more. Part of the explanation appears to lie in their genetics, specifically a subvariant of a gene called BHLHE41. Scientists are now trying to understand what this gene does and how it confers resilience to such little sleep. Having learned this, I imagine that some readers now believe that they are one of these individuals. That is very, very unlikely. The gene is remarkably rare, with but a subset of individuals in the world estimated to carry this anomaly. To impress this fact further, I go to one of my research colleagues, Dr. Thomas Roth, at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, who once said, "The number of people who can survive on 5 hours of sleep or less without any impairments, expressed as a percent of the population and wrote into a whole number, is 0. There is but a fraction of 1% of the population who are truly resilient to the effects of chronic sleep restriction at all level of brain function. It is far, far more likely that you will be struck by lightning The lifetime odds being 1 in 12,000, then being truly capable of surviving on insufficient sleep thanks to a rare gene.